Tech Sergeant Jim Simpson served with the 322nd Bomb Group in Europe in World War II. And that's the 451st Bomb Squadron. And he flew B-26 Marauder airplanes, and B-26 was a medium bomber, a bomb load of about 4,000 pounds. And they hit targets such as marshalling yards, ammo dumps, fuel dumps. Prior to D-Day, they were hitting bridges. They went after anti-aircraft replacements. And it was apparently a hell of an aircraft because, among other things, it has the name of the Widowmaker, and it's also known as the Flying Prostitute. And I asked Jim about that. Why that? And he said because, as best they could tell, it had no visible means of support. Jim's wife Connie is here with us. We've got Jeff, right? Jeff Lemworth, Simone, his daughter. Greg is right there, his son. And we've got Mark and James, grandchildren here today. And I'm not going to tell too many Jim Simpson stories. I told most of them last night at the dinner we had over at Brennan's. But I've known him a long time. Tried lawsuits with him. He's a heck of a guy. He got out of the Army Air Force at the end of World War II. Got a law degree. Became an FBI agent. Was primarily noted down in the area where he comes from in Texas City. Is the guy that cleaned up Galveston Island back in the 1950s. And he's going to talk to us for a few minutes about his service in World War II with the Air Force.
Put that on your I want to put a little taping here.
Can you do that for me? Stupid, appreciate it. Don't get up without taking this off, or you can find another tie.
We can hear you, Ron.
Yeah, I hope so.
Can you folks hear me back there in the back? When I was a very young lawyer and anxious to get acquainted and have my name impressed on the minds of people that they might find their way to my door so I might stave the wolf away from the door of my home, I used to make a lot of speeches to civic clubs and the like. I spoke to one time, and I asked that same question. Can you folks back there in the back hear me? One guy said, no, I can't hear you. Fellow sitting up on the front row said, I can hear him perfectly, and I'll be only too happy to trade places with you. You know, as we approach this, the topic of today, I think we need to keep in mind the nature of the atmosphere prevailing in America at the time of the Second World War. I was an 18-year-old high school student when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. I wanted to go away immediately, but my precious mother, who valued an education, having had only a fourth grade education herself, she said, I will not sign the papers until you finish high school. So I went on and finished high school 6 months later. Got out on the highway and hitchhiked down to Fort Sam Houston, where I took an examination to be admitted as an aviation cadet in the pilot training program. I had only a diploma from about a fourth-rate high school, had never taken a number of the subjects on which I was to be examined, but by some miracle, I passed. You had to make an 80, and I made exactly 80. I didn't give them back points. And then when I came back from the war, it was interesting how the atmosphere in America was. Anybody who did not serve during the war must have felt terribly uneasy. I've often thought how unfair it was that people who had some disability or another couldn't serve and wanted to serve, I'm sure, but they became victimized. I felt it myself on returning from the war. I grew up here in Coppers Cove in Coryell County back in the 30s, and I was walking down the street a few days after I was mustered out at Fort Sam, and we were in summer khakis at that time, but I was in civilian clothing because I had gotten a discharge under a point system. I had enough points. I was probably one of the very first combat troops to be discharged. They'd had enough of me. And so I was walking down the street with an old friend of mine, and he was telling me what a break he had during the war. Had been stationed over on Bermuda, where he had never once heard a shot fired in anger. And he allowed us how the only danger he courted was in catching the clap from some from some tourist who was visiting Bermuda. Ron, that guy was in the U.S. Army Air Force, I might.
We can't solve that, don't worry.
And so, anyway, he was very interesting to the old gentleman farmer that we met. And the old man, for whom I had picked cotton just a few years before, he didn't recognize me and paid me scant little attention because I was in civilian clothes and therefore not of any great interest. But he turned to my good friend and he said, "Calvin, where was you?" Calvin said, "Well, Mr. Tyler, I was over on Bermuda Island." And I could just see the wheels turning in the old man's brain. And he was visualizing some bloodbath out in the Pacific like Joe Reynolds had to tangle with. And so the old man said to Calvin, "Well, Calvin," it was a common phrase of the day, said, "Calvin, I reckon you'd just rather not talk about it." Calvin said, "Mr. Tyler, if you don't mind." You know, there are few things in life about which I'm so sentimental that I cannot be trusted. One is my love of country. Another is my admiration of men who are true heroes, about which I don't begin to qualify. And so my family have insisted that I read my remarks rather than trying to speak verbatim, because I get misty-eyed sometimes, and I'll try to avoid that by reading my remarks. First of all, let me pay tribute to Lee Ware and to this firm that puts on this occasion. It's so great that at least once a year, a large number of people under Lee's guidance take time to stop and reflect on what Armistice Day means and what it means to have had a nation that offered up so many people ready, willing, and able to defend this nation of ours and what it believes in. And it's great that Lee does all this. I told him last night, I said, "Lee, we could pay the national debt if you just canceled these parties." You know, back during my childhood, November 11th was thought of as Armistice Day. I had a brush with Armistice Day while I was in France during the Second War. I was in the B-26 medium bombardment group, and we moved, after D-Day, we moved to the continent. We always spoke of it as, "I'm going to be over on the continent today." We were tall cotton, and that was before we moved to the continent. But when we moved over there, we moved to a small village named Beauvais near Paris, and we lived in an apple orchard, put up pyramidal tents, and there we set sail to bomb the Germans. And so it's about there that I pick up with reading. I want to talk about the air war in Europe, which was pivotal to the outcome of the Second World War. By the time of Pearl Harbor, the Battle of Britain had been fought, and the Royal Air Force had valiantly turned back the German onslaught, but it was accomplished at the expense of sacrificing huge numbers of men and machines. The German army occupied virtually all of France, and it appeared that the days of the British Empire may be numbered. Had Britain fallen, there would have been no staging area from which to launch the liberation of the European continent. It was imperative that America act rapidly to transform itself from a nation mired in the doldrums of the Great Depression to a massive war machine. The nation had to take poorly educated people like me and train them to operate highly sophisticated weapons of war. It was essential that America master her might. A good example of that phenomenon was the training of a pilot with whom I was later to fly, Tom Maddox. I was on the crew of a B-26 bomber in the 9th Air Force on November 9th, 1944, when our bomber made a deep penetration into the Third Reich. The plane was piloted by Tom Maddox. Lieutenant Maddox was 2 years out of a cotton field in Arkansas. That's what's so remarkable to me. How we were able to take a guy like that. He had never seen the inside of a college. Didn't know what trigonometry or calculus meant. You take, for instance, nowadays a pilot, a young man going into pilot training will have a degree, perhaps like one of our participants, a graduate of U.S. Air Force Academy. But here was a guy totally uneducated except for a high school education, which I can testify wasn't all that great a shakes in 1942. And Tom Maddox became a pilot. He was so good that an airplane became an extension of him. He was that good, and which will become important here in a minute. The November 9th mission was flown by Lieutenant Maddox, and I was a member of that crew. We were damaged greatly over the target and were buffeted by high winds, which caused us to consume a lot more fuel than we normally would. So we're on our way back from having bombed the railroad yards at Koblenz when a red warning light comes on telling the pilot that he has 15 minutes in which to lay that bomber down somewhere. No question, it was going to be on the ground somewhere in some condition or another. So we all started frantically looking for a place to lay that bomber down. And we saw a German airfield, which the Luftwaffe had used, but the runways were pocked with big holes built by our own American Air Force on prior missions. So we had to pass that up as a place to land. And soon Maddox saw a tiny roadway between two villages near Dijon, France. He decided that that was our only hope. So he gets on the intercom and he tells us, I'm going to lay this bomber down. Any of you who are interested in it are free to bail out. You'll not be charged with desertion, but you're free to bail out. Well, I looked down into the bowels of the Third Reich, and a snowstorm was raging beneath. I thought, hell, if I survive the crash, the parachute jump, I won't survive that vicious weather. Besides which, I wasn't too anxious to become a prisoner of the Germans. That, incidentally, was one of my deepest fears. I didn't worry so much about getting killed. Too young to think about the consequences of getting injured desperately. But I worried about being captured, partly because of my freedom being destroyed and being bored to tears. And so we were all given that choice, but I elected to stay with Lieutenant Maddox in the bomber. So we had one problem. That was the roadway was clogged with rural traffic. It was, of course, a matter of great fascination for those villagers to look up and see a twin-engine, high-performance bomber, looking rather menacing. I'm sure they wondered whether it was American or was it German. And so they were down there on the roadway, and we couldn't land on top of them. So the pilot took one pass over the roadway and lowered that massive tricycle landing gear that a B-26 has. You might inspect some of these pictures over here and you can understand better what I'm talking about. So he lowers that landing gear, and those folks got out of Dodge quicker than I can tell you. And but he brought that bomber down on this tiny roadway, barely wide enough to accommodate that big, high, wide landing gear of a B-26. He laid it down just as smoothly as if we were landing at LaGuardia Field. Now, bear in mind, this is a kid right off the farm. He's had 2 or 3 years in the service. When my friend here to my left went to pilot training, he was already a graduate of the U.S. Air Force Academy, had a fine education behind him. But there wasn't time for that in the Second World War. Time was of the essence. But Maddox laid that bomber down smoothly, and we discovered rapidly that we had landed within Allied lines because a bunch of folks gathered around the airplane. They were thrilled to see this old bomber. It kind of reminded me of when I grew up in Coryell County back in the 30s. Every now and then a barnstormer would come through the countryside. And all he had to do was come through and land. He didn't need any advance advertisement or anything, because all the villagers of Copper's Cove gathered to see this marvelous machine. Shows you how close we were. Heck, Lindbergh had crossed the ocean only 14, 15 years earlier than when we were flying missions that embraced 2,000, if you can believe it, 2,000 bombers, most of them heavies. And so anyway, after the landing, we kind of needed to know where we were. The Navigator had not been able to stay up with the course because the winds were so high and the weather was so awful. Well, no fault of his. So we really were not sure as to whether we were landing within Allied lines. And so once we landed, the French people were very hospitable. Some of them broke out wine and champagne, almost like a Lee Ware party. And we became the heroes of the moment. I've often thought we all are entitled to our 15 minutes of fame. Maybe this is ours here today. But anyway, this was on November 9th, 1944. The next day, November 10th, 1944, we made our way over to Dijon Army Air Base, which was a night fighter base, and found that we were only 200 miles away from our own air base back near Paris. And I spoke to the pilot, and he told me, he said, you know, Jim, we've got to make a connection with our own base, that they may be flying combat missions back there. I said, yeah, they probably are. He was anxious to get back. I said, I'm not unduly anxious. Brave men run in my family. So I told Tom, though, I said, a few days later, they pinned the Distinguished Flying Cross on him, which he richly deserved. I told him, I said, Tom, you win the DFC and the rest of us lose 10 years of growth. With which he quite agreed. Well, I know I've used up my 15 minutes of time. My son-in-law, who's keeping time over here for me, says, yes, you have, Jim. You have done violated. But let me stress what a great privilege and honor it is to be here with this group today, with Lee Ware and his law firm and all of you folks, and every one of these men here beside me. We are, I think, indeed a band of brothers. We reach across time, decades of time, going way back from the Second World War up to Korea, where Joe Reynolds served, as well as having served in the Second War, and then into Vietnam. And so I appreciate your attention, and hope I haven't embarrassed my family unduly.
We love you.
Oh, you're very kind.
My wife is crying.
Oh, good.
The experience on landing, there's a diary for the 322nd Bomb Group, which was the bomb group that Jim belonged to, and there's a diary that records that, and it comments on that the pilot did the impossible when he did that, and it wasn't all fun and games on the 322nd Bomb Group. On July the 8th of that year, a few months before when Jim was talking about, they lost 4 aircraft on one mission, and out of the 27 people that were aboard the 4 aircraft, there were 6 men that were crew, and there were some staff officers on board doing something. Out of the 27 men that were on board, 19 of them were killed, 5 of them were captured, 2 of them were missing and presumed dead. And so it wasn't all a great experience for them. The 322nd Bomb Group is a famous bomb group. The Flak Bait, there's a photograph over here behind Eric over there. The Flak Bait is the aircraft that's in the Smithsonian. It's a B-26. It came out of that bomb group, and that's the aircraft that flew more missions than any other aircraft in World War II, 202 missions total. So thanks a lot, Jim, for everything you did. The initial thank you that he got, among other decorations, Jim wears 11 air medals, by the way. Mr. Sergeant.